The engine roars as the fighter claws into the air, rising fast above the steel deck of an American aircraft carrier. Below, the ocean is calm. Ahead, the sky is not. October 1943. Over Wake Island, a U.S. Navy pilot grips the controls and scans the horizon. The air feels strangely empty, until it isn't. Tiny silhouettes appear in the distance, dark shapes moving quickly against the bright Pacific light. At first, they look like birds. Then the sunlight catches their wings, Japanese fighters. And in the next few seconds, everything happens at once. The pilot tightens his turn, ready for the moment every Navy aviator knows too well. The moment the enemy gets behind you, the moment you realize you're slower, the moment you realize you can't outturn them. Because for nearly 2 years, the Japanese Zero had ruled the skies of the Pacific. It had humiliated American pilots in the early months of the war. It had turned dogfights into executions. And it had built a reputation so terrifying that U.S. flight manuals actually warned pilots not to engage. But this time, something is different. This time, the Japanese pilots aren't the hunters. They're flying into a fight they don't fully understand. Because somewhere behind this American pilot is a new machine. A fighter built for one purpose, not to dance with the Zero, but to destroy it. And by the end of this war, Japanese pilots would fear its name like a curse, the F6F Hellcat. To understand why Japanese pilots feared the Hellcat, you have to understand what came before it. Because early in the Pacific War, there was one aircraft that seemed almost untouchable, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. In 1941 and 1942, the Zero wasn't just winning dogfights, it was rewriting the rules of aerial combat. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, their pilots were among the best trained in the world. Many of them had years of combat experience from China. They had mastered formation tactics, gunnery, and the brutal instincts of air-to-air fighting. And the Zero was the perfect weapon for them. It was light, it was fast, and most terrifying of all, it could turn tighter than almost anything the Americans could put into the sky. In the first months of the war, American and Allied pilots often described it the same way. They would spot a Zero, they would try to engage, and within seconds, the Zero was behind them. A flash of tracer fire, then smoke, then silence. Many U.S. pilots made one fatal mistake again and again. They tried to fight the Zero like it was a normal fighter. They tried to turn with it, and against the Zero, turning was death. The Japanese aircraft didn't need to be faster in a straight line if it could outturn you and cut inside your circle. It didn't need to climb higher if it could simply pivot in the air like a hawk and force you into its guns. That agility came from a ruthless design philosophy. The Zero was built to be as light as possible. It sacrificed protection to gain performance. It carried no meaningful armor for the pilot. It had limited protection for its fuel tanks. It was a blade, razor sharp, but fragile. And in 1942, almost nobody cared that it was fragile because almost nobody could hit it. The Americans were flying aircraft like the F4F Wildcat, sturdy but slower and nowhere near as nimble. A Wildcat pilot could survive longer in a fight, but only if he stopped trying to win the old way. U.S. combat manuals began to emphasize survival tactics. They told pilots to avoid turning fights, avoid low-speed duels, use teamwork, use altitude. And if a Zero got behind you, dive. Because in a dive, the Wildcat had one advantage. It could build speed quickly and hold together under stress. A steep dive was often the only escape route, but even diving away didn't guarantee safety. In the chaos of early engagements, pilots didn't always have enough altitude to dive. Many were caught, climbing or returning to their carriers or protecting bombers, slow, predictable targets. And the Zero feasted on those moments. It gained an almost supernatural reputation, not because it was invincible, but because it fought at a time when the U.S. Navy was learning the war the hard way. And every month that passed only sharpened the fear. At places like Wake Island, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Allied pilots discovered that courage and skill alone weren't enough. It didn't matter how brave you were if your aircraft simply couldn't match the enemy's strengths. In the ready rooms aboard American carriers, pilots talked about the Zero the way infantry talk about a machine gun nest. You didn't duel it, you survived it. Because for about 18 months, the Zero represented a terrifying truth. The United States was not ready for this kind of war in the air, but the Zero's greatest strength was also its hidden weakness. To be that light had to give up something. And once the Americans discovered exactly what it had given up, the balance of power began to shift. Because somewhere out there, in the vast Pacific, the U.S. Navy was about to get the one thing it needed most, not another rumor, not another guess, but a real Zero, captured, tested, and revealed. In war, information can be more valuable than firepower, and in 1942, the United States was handed a gift so unlikely, it almost sounds like fiction. A Japanese Zero, captured nearly intact. It began during a raid in the Aleutian Islands, a cold and remote stretch of territory that felt like the edge of the world. Japanese aircraft attacked American positions, and American fighters rose to meet them. In the chaos of combat, one Zero was hit. The pilot, injured and losing control, looked for somewhere, anywhere, to land. He spotted a flat, grassy area on Akutan Island. From the air, it looked like solid ground, but it wasn't. It was a bog. The Zero touched down, its wheels sank, and the aircraft flipped violently onto its back. The pilot didn't survive, but the plane did, and that one accident changed the Pacific Air War. When U.S. forces reached the site, they realized what they were looking at. A Zero that hadn't been blown apart, burned, or reduced to twisted wreckage. It was mostly intact, and for the first time, the Americans didn't have to guess how the Zero flew. They could measure it, they could test it, they could push it to its limits and watch where it broke. The aircraft was recovered, shipped to the United States, repaired just enough to fly again, and then handed to test pilots who were told to do something no combat pilot had ever been able to do safely: fight the Zero without fear. They climbed into the cockpit, lifted off the runway, and began putting the aircraft through every maneuver imaginable. Turns, rolls, dives, climb tests, stall behavior, high-speed passes, and what they found was shocking. Not because the Zero was weak, but because it was predictable. The Zero's legendary agility was real, but it came with clear trade-offs. At high speeds, its controls began to stiffen. It became harder to roll quickly. The aircraft could still turn, but its response slowed, especially when pushed beyond its ideal envelope. In a dive, it could not safely match heavier American fighters that were built to withstand brutal stress. If you forced the Zero into a high-speed chase downward, it risked structural damage, control issues, and loss of effectiveness. They also learned that the Zero's design, built to save weight, came with vulnerability. A lack of heavy armor, limited fuel protection, a pilot who sat in what was essentially a flying shell, and most importantly, they discovered something that would shape U.S. tactics for the rest of the war. The Zero excelled when it could fight on its terms: low-speed turning duels, tight circles, close range, snapshots. But if you refused to play that game, the Zero struggled. The U.S. Navy didn't keep these findings secret, they turned them into doctrine. Reports were distributed, pilots were briefed, training shifted rapidly. Instead of teaching men to dogfight the Zero, they taught them to hunt it, use altitude, use speed, attack from above, fire in a fast pass and climb away before the Zero could trap you in a turn. And if the Zero tried to follow you into a dive, let it. Because now American pilots knew something they hadn't known before. The Zero could be beaten, not by trying to outturn it, but by forcing it into the parts of the sky where it was weakest. The captured Zero didn't win battles by itself, but it gave the U.S. Navy something priceless: confidence, a clear understanding of the enemy, and a roadmap to victory. But even with new tactics, the Americans still faced a hard truth. Winning a war in the air required more than clever maneuvers. It required an aircraft that could survive mistakes, an aircraft that could absorb punishment, come home, be repaired, and fly again. And an aircraft that could fight the Zero on equal terms, without demanding perfection from the pilot. Because the U.S. Navy was about to bring something to the Pacific that Japan wasn't prepared for. A fighter built not for elegance, but for war. The Grumman F6F Hellcat. By 1942, the U.S. Navy had learned two painful lessons. First, the Zero was deadly and it could not be ignored. Second, even if you knew how to fight it, you still needed an aircraft that could take punishment and keep flying. The Wildcat had held the line, but the Navy needed something more, something faster, stronger, more heavily armed, and built to dominate the kind of battles that were coming next. Massive carrier clashes, long-range strikes, endless waves of aircraft, and a war that would be won not by a single ace, but by an entire system. That aircraft was the Grumman F6F Hellcat, and it wasn't designed to be elegant. It was designed to be unstoppable. Grumman had a reputation for building fighters that could survive almost anything. Navy pilots joked that a Grumman aircraft could take hits, limp back to the carrier, and still be ready to fly again after a quick patch-up. The Hellcat took that philosophy and turned it into a weapon. From the beginning, it was built around one idea: a Navy fighter had to survive. It had to survive flak. It had to survive bullets. It had to survive rough carrier landings, bad weather, and damage that would tear lighter aircraft apart. So the Hellcat was built heavy. Its airframe was tough and thick. Its cockpit was protected with armor. Its fuel tanks were designed to seal themselves if punctured, reducing the chance of fire. Its engine, the powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800, gave it the raw strength to climb, accelerate, and fight at higher speeds than earlier Navy fighters. And the moment pilots got their hands on it, they felt the difference. The Hellcat wasn't a fragile knife like the Zero. It was a hammer, and it came with tools the Zero couldn't match. First, speed and power. At a time when many Japanese fighters were still built around lightness and turning ability, the Hellcat had the horsepower to fight vertically, diving, climbing, using altitude like a weapon. It could choose when to engage and when to break away. Second, firepower. The Hellcat carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns, heavy, fast-firing weapons that could shred an enemy aircraft in seconds. This mattered because one of the most dangerous things about fighting the Zero was that you often had only a split second to fire before the turning fight began. In that split second, you needed hits, not warning shots. The Hellcat delivered them. Third, reliability and ease of use. The Hellcat was built for carrier operations. It was stable on approach, forgiving in landing, and easier to fly than many high-performance fighters. That may not sound glamorous, but it mattered. Because war doesn't just punish aircraft, it punishes pilots. In the Pacific, men flew long missions over endless ocean. They fought at the edge of exhaustion. They landed on moving decks in rough seas with fuel nearly gone. A fighter that demanded perfection would kill its own pilots. The Hellcat gave them a margin for error. It allowed average pilots to survive, and it allowed good pilots to become lethal. That's why, when the Hellcat entered combat, it didn't arrive as a rumor. It arrived as a shift in reality. Japanese pilots had spent the first year of the war fighting opponents who were often slower, less agile, and still learning the battlefield. Now they were facing a fighter that could match them in the air and outlast them in the war. And the Hellcat didn't appear in small numbers. It arrived in waves because the United States didn't just build aircraft. It built factories, it built supply chains, it built a machine that could flood the Pacific with new planes and train pilots faster than Japan could replace what it lost. The Hellcat became the symbol of that machine, and soon it would become the aircraft that Japanese pilots learned to recognize from far away. A wide, powerful silhouette, a fast approach, a brutal burst of gunfire, and then, if you survived, the realization that the skies were no longer safe. Because the Hellcat wasn't just a new fighter, it was the beginning of the end for the Zero's reign, and the first true test was coming. Not in the design labs, not in training, but in real combat, where Japanese pilots would try every trick they knew, only to discover that the old methods no longer worked. The first time Japanese pilots met the Hellcat in combat, many of them didn't immediately realize what they were facing. At a distance, it looked like another American naval fighter. But once the fight began, the difference was impossible to ignore. The Hellcat was faster than what they were used to. It climbed with authority. It dove like a stone. And when it fired, it didn't just damage aircraft. It tore them apart. One of the earliest signs that the air war was changing came during the expanding U.S. offensives in the Central Pacific, operations that forced Japanese air power into defensive battles it had never planned for. Instead of ambushing Allied forces at will, Japanese pilots found themselves scrambling to protect islands, airfields, and shipping from carrier raids that struck hard and vanished back into the open sea. The Hellcat was built for these raids. American carriers could launch waves of fighters and bombers, strike targets deep behind Japanese lines, and then fight their way out against interceptors. And in these early encounters, a pattern emerged. Japanese pilots tried to fight the Hellcat the same way they fought the Wildcat. They tried to pull it into a turning contest. They tried to get behind it and stay there. But the Hellcat didn't behave like the aircraft they were used to killing. When a Zero tried to turn inside it, the Hellcat pilot didn't panic. He didn't accept the duel. He pushed the throttle forward, gained speed, and climbed away. Or he rolled, dove, and turned the fight into a high-speed chase the Zero couldn't win. And when the Zero made the mistake of following into that kind of fight, it became vulnerable. The Hellcat could roll faster at high speeds. It could hold together in a dive. It could regain altitude quickly with its powerful engine. It didn't have to dance. It only had to strike. American pilots began using aggressive hit-and-run attacks, diving from above, firing in a fast burst, and then climbing back to safety before a Zero could respond. It was a method designed to exploit everything the captured Zero tests had revealed, and the Hellcat made it easier to execute. But what truly shocked Japanese pilots wasn't just the Hellcat's performance, it was its toughness. In countless engagements, Hellcats returned to their carriers riddled with holes, wings torn, fuselage damaged, control surfaces shredded, aircraft that, by all logic, should have been gone. And yet, they landed. They were repaired. And they flew again. For Japanese pilots, that was a disturbing sight. The Zero could win by landing a few clean hits because most of its enemies were vulnerable. But the Hellcat changed the equation. It could take hits and stay in the fight. It could take damage and still get home. And that meant a Japanese pilot had to do something extremely dangerous to win. He had to stay close longer. He had to keep firing. He had to press the attack deeper into enemy gunfire. And that was where the Hellcat's .650 caliber guns became terrifying. Because unlike many earlier fighters, the Hellcat didn't require perfect aim. It could flood the sky with lead. If a Zero crossed in front of its nose, even for a second, the chance of survival dropped sharply. Through 1943 and into early 1944, the Hellcat's victories piled up in raid after raid, over places like Wake, Tarawa, Rabaul, and the Marshall Islands. And the numbers began to tell a story that Japanese commanders could not ignore. The Zero, once the symbol of dominance, was being shot down at a rate that was no longer sustainable. But beyond the statistics was something more important. The psychology of the fight had changed. In 1942, American pilots feared the Zero. They feared its turning ability, its sudden appearance, the way it could punish mistakes instantly. Now, Japanese pilots were beginning to fear the Hellcat, not because it was unbeatable in a single duel, but because it didn't need to be. The Hellcat could lose a turning contest and still win the battle. It could take a hit and still escape. It could strike once and end the fight instantly. And it was almost always backed by something the Zero rarely faced in 1942, coordination, discipline, waves of aircraft launched from carriers with radios, tactics, and a growing confidence that they were no longer prey. For Japanese pilots, this created a new kind of terror. It wasn't the fear of one enemy ace, it was the fear of an entire sky full of Hellcats. Because every time they fought one, they were fighting more than a plane. They were fighting a system that was learning faster than they could adapt. And as the war moved forward, that system only grew stronger. More pilots, more carriers, more Hellcats. And soon, the scale of the fighting would reach a level the Zero could not survive. Because the next phase of the war wasn't just about individual encounters, it was about replacement, attrition, and whether Japan could endure what the Hellcat was doing to its air power. Even in 1943, the Zero was still dangerous. In the hands of a skilled veteran, it could still kill. It could still punish mistakes. And in a perfect one-on-one dogfight, it could still outturn almost anything the Americans flew. But by this stage of the war, the Pacific Air War wasn't being decided by perfect dogfights. It was being decided by something colder, something industrial, something mathematical, replacement, because the Hellcat didn't win the war by being a better airplane in isolation. It won because it was part of a machine that Japan could not match. The United States was building new carriers, new airfields, new supply routes, and new squadrons at a pace that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. And every time a carrier arrived in the Pacific, it didn't come with just a few planes. It came with an entire air group, dozens of fighters, dozens of pilots, all trained, organized, and supported by a logistics network that stretched across the ocean. The Hellcat was built for that world. It was simple enough to produce in massive numbers. It was reliable enough to keep flying in brutal conditions. And it was forgiving enough that new pilots could learn it quickly and survive their first combat missions. That last part mattered more than most people realize, because Japan's greatest advantage early in the war wasn't the Zero itself. It was the pilots flying it. Before the war, Japanese naval aviation training was extremely demanding. It produced elite aviators, men with thousands of hours, sharp instincts, and exceptional coordination. In 1941 and 1942, those pilots were terrifying. They could outmaneuver opponents. They could lead formations with discipline. They could make a single burst of cannon fire count. But war has a way of destroying even the best training system. Because once losses begin, you need replacements. And replacements take time. Japan didn't have the same time the United States had. They didn't have the same fuel reserves for training. They didn't have the same industrial output. And as the war expanded, they began losing veteran pilots faster than they could replace them. Every battle forced Japan to spend what it could least afford to spend: experience. Meanwhile, the United States was doing the opposite. Early in the war, American pilots were inexperienced in combat, but their training pipeline improved rapidly. They standardized tactics, they expanded training programs, they increased flight hours. And by 1943 and 1944, new American pilots were arriving with better preparation than the men who had fought at the beginning. And unlike Japan, the U.S. could afford the cost: fuel, aircraft, time, all of it. So while Japan was sending newer and less experienced pilots into combat with fewer flight hours, the United States was sending larger numbers of pilots with increasing skill, backed by more carriers and better coordination. That difference showed up in the air. A Japanese veteran might still win a duel, but he could not win a war against endless waves of trained pilots flying durable aircraft. And there was another advantage that made it even worse for Japan: technology. By 1943, American carriers and task forces were increasingly using radar to detect incoming enemy aircraft. That meant Japanese pilots were no longer flying into surprise attacks the way they had early in the war. Instead, they often found American fighters already climbing to meet them, already positioned at altitude, already moving into interception formations. The Hellcat loved that kind of fight, because with altitude and speed, it could hit hard, disengage, climb back up, and attack again. It could fight like a predator. And the Japanese pilots, many of them newer, less trained, and less confident, were forced to fight in the worst possible situation. They were the ones being hunted. Day after day, raid after raid, Japan lost planes and pilots it could not replace. And this was the brutal truth of the late Pacific War. A Japanese ace was priceless. But an ace cannot win when he is surrounded by rookies. And even worse, an ace cannot win when he is outnumbered 10-1. The Hellcat became the symbol of that imbalance, not just because of what it could do, but because of how many of them kept appearing. And Japan understood what was coming. They could feel it in every interception. Every battle was getting harder. Every mistake was more costly. Every victory felt smaller. And then came the moment when the entire balance of power collapsed in a single fight. A battle so devastating that it shattered Japanese naval aviation almost overnight. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The day American pilots gave it a name that sounded almost casual, but was anything but: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the summer of 1944, the war had reached a breaking point. The United States was advancing across the Pacific in a methodical, unstoppable push, capturing island after island, building airfields, and moving its carrier fleets closer and closer to Japan itself. One target mattered more than the rest: the Mariana Islands. If the Americans could take them, they could build bases for long-range bombers. They could strike Japan directly. They could choke the empire from the air. Japan knew it too. And so, in June 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy made a decision. They would gamble everything on one massive carrier battle. They would throw their remaining air power into the fight, and they would try to crush the American fleet in a single blow. It was their last chance to regain control of the sky. The battle that followed became one of the most decisive air engagements in history: the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The morning began with tension and long-range scouting. Japanese carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft: fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, hundreds of planes sent across the ocean to find and destroy the American carriers. But the Americans were no longer blind. Radar picked up the incoming raids far beyond visual range. For the first time in the war, American fighters didn't have to wait for the enemy to appear. They could prepare, they could climb, they could position themselves at altitude, and when the Japanese aircraft arrived, they flew into a sky that was already armed and ready. Squadrons of Hellcats rose to intercept, and what happened next was not a heroic duel, it was a slaughter. The Japanese pilots pressed forward in scattered formations, many of them inexperienced, some of them terrified, trying to follow orders in the middle of chaos. But the Hellcats met them with speed, altitude, and discipline. The Americans didn't try to turn with the Zeros. They attacked from above. They fired in fast, brutal passes. They rolled away, then climbed back into position to strike again. For Japanese pilots, it felt like fighting an enemy that could appear, attack, vanish, and return before you could even regain control of the battle. A Zero could still turn tight, but turning didn't matter when you were being attacked repeatedly from above by faster aircraft that refused to stay in your sights. And the Hellcat had one more advantage that made it deadly in these interception battles: its guns. 6 heavy machine guns firing at high speed, throwing a storm of bullets into the air. Against fragile Japanese aircraft, it only took a moment. One burst, one hit. A wing would shear, a fuel tank would ignite, a cockpit would fill with smoke. Planes that once terrified American pilots were now falling into the sea in flames. In some engagements, American pilots described it as almost unbelievable. The Japanese kept coming, and the Hellcats kept cutting them down. One of the most famous moments came from Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, who became the Navy's top ace of the war. In a single day, he shot down multiple enemy aircraft, leading his squadron through chaos with calm precision. Another Hellcat pilot, Alexander Vrashew, became legendary for shooting down 6 Japanese dive bombers in a matter of minutes, an act so fast and violent it almost defied the imagination. But the true story wasn't just about individual aces, it was about the scale. The Japanese lost aircraft at a rate that was catastrophic. They lost trained pilots, what remained of them, at a rate they could never recover from. And when the battle ended, the numbers told the truth more clearly than any dramatic story ever could. Japan's carrier air power had been shattered. Its pilots were gone, its aircraft were gone, and its ability to fight a modern air war from carriers was broken. That is why American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Not because it was easy, not because it was fun, but because the outcome was so one-sided it felt unreal. For Japanese, or pilots who survived, the lesson was unforgettable. The Hellcat was not just an airplane, it was the new reality of the sky. A fighter that could climb to meet you, dive to kill you, absorb damage, return to fight again. And it came in numbers you could not stop. After the Philippine Sea, the Zero was no longer a symbol of dominance, it was a symbol of a past era. And the fear that once lived in American ready rooms now lived in Japanese cockpits, because the Hellcat had done something no other aircraft had done so completely. It had taken control of the sky away from Japan, and it was not giving it back. So why did Japanese pilots fear the F6F Hellcat? Not in the dramatic sense, not as a legend, but in the real practical way that pilots fear a machine that can end their life in seconds. The answer is simple. The Hellcat was everything the Zero wasn't, and it arrived at the exact moment Japan could no longer adapt. First, the Hellcat could survive. The Zero was built around lightness and agility, but it paid for that with vulnerability. The Hellcat was built to take punishment. Its armor protected the pilot. Its fuel tanks sealed themselves when hit. Its structure could absorb damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters. For a Japanese pilot, this was terrifying, because it meant your first burst might not be enough, and in air combat, hesitation kills. Second, the Hellcat hit harder. With 650 caliber machine guns, it could unleash a devastating volume of fire. Against fragile Japanese aircraft, a single hit could ignite fuel, snap a wing, or shred control cables. In the past, a Zero pilot could rely on speed and maneuvering to stay alive. Against a Hellcat, crossing its guns for even a moment could be fatal. Third, the Hellcat could choose the fight. It had the speed to engage or disengage. It could dive away and the Zero often couldn't safely follow. It could climb back up and attack again. That meant the Hellcat pilot controlled the rhythm of the battle, and the Zero pilot was forced to react. Fourth, the Hellcat was part of a larger system. Radar gave American pilots early warning. Carrier operations became increasingly coordinated. American formations were disciplined and aggressive, designed to protect each other and strike as a unit. So a Japanese pilot wasn't fighting one Hellcat. He was fighting a sky organized against him. And finally, the reason that truly broke Japan's air power. The Hellcat kept coming. Japan could build planes, but it could not replace the experienced pilots it lost. The United States could replace both. Every battle cost Japan something permanent, but for America, losses could be absorbed. New Hellcats arrived, new pilots arrived, and the pressure never stopped. So Japanese pilots feared the Hellcat not just because it was strong. They feared it because it represented a future they couldn't escape. A future where turning fights no longer mattered. A future where skill wasn't enough. A future where the sky belonged to an enemy who could strike harder, survive longer, and return again and again. The Zero had once ruled the Pacific, but the Hellcat ended that reign. And when Japanese pilots saw its silhouette cutting through the clouds, many of them knew what it meant. It meant the hunters had become the hunted. The story of the F6F Hellcat is the story of a turning point. In the beginning of the war, the Zero ruled the skies through agility, experience, and fear. But the Hellcat arrived with a different philosophy. It wasn't built to be fragile and perfect. It was built to survive, to fight hard, and to keep coming back. And that's why Japanese pilots feared it. Because when the Hellcat took control of the Pacific sky, it didn't just win dogfights. It changed the outcome of the war. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more war history documentaries, and tell me in the comments, which aircraft do you think had the biggest impact on the Pacific War? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.